There was a tree growing in my backyard, and I had no idea where it had come from. I just looked out my kitchen window one day, and there it was, a spindly little thing with yellow-tinged oblong leaves and thin white bark. I had only recently moved into the house, so I just assumed the tree had been something that the previous owners had planted, but it was odd that I hadn't noticed it up until that moment. One of the main selling points of the house had been the small patch of green outside the kitchen door, only big enough for a couple of flower beds and a deck chair or two, maybe a small grill. But having spent the last 20 years of my life in apartment buildings, I was thrilled to have any kind of yard at all. There were a few overgrown shrubs that I'd had pruned back, and there was a vine of some sort that grew along the wood picket fencing, but I'd never noticed that tree there. And it had to have been there for at least several weeks in the far corner by the gate, because it stood about 5 foot high already. It's not as if a tree that size could have sprung up overnight like a weed. It was certainly a very odd thing, but I tried not to think about it too much. There were all sorts of things about this new house that I was still discovering, most of them needing much more attention than a spindly little tree, like the fact that the bathroom pipes were rotted through and that the wallpaper was peeling away from water damage in the second bedroom. So after the first time of registering that I had a strange little tree in my backyard, I forgot about it, and it just sort of blended into the landscape of my everyday life. Then the tree began to fruit. I thought this was odd, as I hadn't noticed it flowering at all. One day, it just had fruit. But I didn't know that they were fruits at first, because they were nothing like any fruit I'd ever seen before. They were round, extremely spherical like an orange, but only about the size of an apricot, though others were as small as grapes. And they were blue. Very, very blue, like the color of water on a tranquil tropical beach. They were a shade of blue so vivid that my brain refused to believe that they were actually being produced by my spindly little tree. I wondered if someone had snuck into my yard and hung Christmas ornaments, because I couldn't accept them as something naturally occurring. I just kept staring at them, not understanding how they'd gotten there. There was maybe about 20 of them, and I thought briefly about plucking one off the tree to examine it further. Somewhere, in the back of my memory, an ancient high school science class echoed a half-remembered project on deadly plants, and I stopped myself, letting the strange little blue spheres continue to dangle lazily from the ends of the branches. My friend Thomas was an amateur botanist who delighted in keeping all sorts of unusual plants in the makeshift greenhouse he'd built in his own backyard. I called him immediately after I discovered the fruits. He didn't believe me. He thought I was playing a practical joke on him. I took a picture of the tree with my phone and sent it to him. "You're so committed to this that you photoshopped a picture? Jeez," he texted me. I video called him and showed him the tree in real time. "What'd you do, paint some apples?" he smirked. "Just come over here and look at these things. I want to know what they are and if they're dangerous." Reluctantly, he agreed to stop by towards the end of the week. By the time he did come, a few of them had even dropped off the tree, going from the vivid cerulean to a deep, almost navy color. I hadn't disturbed them, too worried that their unnatural hue was the result of some chemical spill in the soil. Thomas remained skeptical, still half thinking I was playing a trick, but after looking at the things for several minutes, his curiosity overtook him. He donned a pair of latex gloves and carefully picked up one of the fruits from the ground. "This is not something you've ever seen before, is it?" I asked. He shook his head and turned the fruit over in his hand. It was shiny and very smooth. He poked at it, and it didn't give. "Is there something that could cause this kind of coloration?" I asked. Thomas delicately pushed his wireframe glasses up his nose with his free hand. "Maybe there's blue-green algae in the soil? But that doesn't make any sense this far away from salt water. Thomas squatted down on the grass and set the fruit on a small mound of dirt. Then he took a utility tool from out of his pocket. I squatted beside him, realizing what he was about to do. Slowly, and with great care, he sawed around the circumference of the fruit with the knife blade. Then he let the thing fall open on the ground. We both gasped. Inside, the fruit was just as shocking a color as the outside was. The main part of the flesh was as pink as a watermelon, but with a creamy, custard-like appearance. The rich fuchsia faded into a violet the closer the flesh got to the skin. At the center of the fruit, there were several large green seeds that almost looked like lima beans, but which had a sheen to them that shimmered in the sunlight. "It's kind of gorgeous," I exclaimed. Thomas picked up one half of the fruit and cautiously sniffed it. "What does it smell like?" I whispered. He didn't respond at first, but just kept sniffing, his hawk-like nose getting closer and closer to the flesh of the fruit. "It's sort of floral," he said at last. "Like roses or tea leaves, but sweet." He dug the knife into the pink flesh of the fruit and carved out a piece. "It's pretty soft," he said, holding the wedge of fruit up so that the sunlight hit it. Droplets of juice fell from the knife's blade, sparkling like jewels. "Do you think it's edible?" I asked hopefully, suddenly intensely curious what this alien fruit might taste like. He shook his head. "There's no way I can tell just by looking at it. I don't even know what family this thing is in. I mean, it's not a stone fruit or a citrus, I'm sure of that. I don't think it's technically a berry either." Thomas shook the fruit off his knife, then popped one of the seeds out with his fingers and squeezed it. The seed released a white liquid. "Huh," said Thomas. "Is it poison?" I asked. "Again, I have no idea. We need to call in a professional pomologist." "I'm guessing that means fruit expert." "Yep. Do you know any?" Thomas's thin lips curled into a slight smile. "I've got connections," he slyly replied. The pomologist Thomas got in contact with was a woman by the name of Dr. Rochelle Freeman, who taught natural sciences at the local university. Thomas had taken one of the fruits with him to show to her, thinking she'd be just as incredulous as he had been about these strange blue orbs. She made him bring her over to my house immediately. I watched the two of them from my kitchen window as they gesticulated wildly at one another, blue fruits held in their gloved hands. "So what do you think they are?" I asked as the two of them entered my kitchen. "I have no idea," Dr. Freeman sighed. "I've never seen anything like them. The tree itself is unremarkable, possibly related to birch, I thought, but no birch trees produce fruits anything like this. It makes no sense." After a little more discussion, Dr. Freeman persuaded me to allow her to take some of the fruits back to her laboratory at the university, where she could analyze them properly. I agreed and handed her some zip-top kitchen bags with which she could collect her specimens. She took fruits at all different stages of maturity, from the navy blue ones on the ground to the ocean water blue ones that still hung tight to the branches. She took some of the leaves as well, a few twigs, and even some of the soil at the base of the tree. Though smallish, the tree was hardy, and I had watched it produce more and more fruit, replenishing itself within days every time one of the spheres dropped to the ground, so I wasn't worried about her harming the thing. The first results that came back from Dr. Freeman confirmed that the fruit was non-toxic, and therefore edible. Thomas pleaded with me to let him try one, but I decided to throw a kind of party for all of my friends instead, most of them having been following along with the saga of the strange fruits through my social media, as I had been posting pictures of the things in hopes someone would recognize them. That way, we could all sample the strange fruits together. The day of the party, Thomas and I brought in a selection of the fruits, choosing some from the tree and some of the fallen ones. "We'll try both versions, and some fruits taste better underripe," he explained. Once all the guests had arrived, about 10 people in total, We gathered everyone in the kitchen and presented the fruits. Everyone picked them up and examined them, feeling their smooth skins and marveling at their extraordinary color. It was sort of like plums, but blue, one person remarked. They're just mutant blueberries, said another. Thomas and I smiled knowingly at one another and began to slice up the fruits, revealing the shockingly pink interior to the astounded crowd. We then opened up one of the tree-picked fruits to reveal that it actually had a yellow interior and smaller red seeds. "Why is there such a huge difference between the ripe and the unripe fruit?" asked one of the guests. "My guess is that these seeds release their red pigment into the flesh of the fruit as they ripen," Thomas explained, placing the juicy wedges onto a plate. "But that's only a guess, as I've never heard of something like that happening in any other species." We plated 2 wedges each for every person, one of the ripe fruit and one of the underripe. Thomas guided us all as he picked up his wedge of deep blue ripened fruit and held it up. "Now on the first bite, let's all try to only taste the flesh. Nothing in this fruit is carcinogenic, but sometimes fruit skins can be a bit tart, so to get a true idea of the flavor, we want to stay away from that first." Collectively, we all bit into our wedges of fruit and scraped the flesh from the skin, pink juice dripping down everyone's hands and faces. I closed my eyes and chewed. Though the flesh had appeared creamy, it had a certain firmness to it, like a mango, but after a bite or two, it turned into pure juice that coated my tongue. The flavor was almost indescribable. The only thing I can think to say about it is that it tasted like every food I'd ever had all at once. There was strawberry and melon and banana and pear, but there was also ice cream and popcorn and toasted chestnuts. It was salty and sweet and sour, even a little spicy, lighting up all of my taste buds like a switchboard. When I opened my eyes, I observed the shocked expressions of my friends. One of them was scowling in disgust. Another spit the fruit into her hand. Others were positively moaning with delight. "Oh my God, it's amazing," said one person. "I don't know, it's kind of rancid," said another. The truth of the matter was, I wasn't quite sure who I agreed with. One moment, I adored the complex flavor of the fruit, and the next, I felt it triggering my gag reflex. "It's exquisite," Thomas proclaimed just before he nibbled off a tiny portion of the blue skin. His eyes widened. "Oh my God, everyone try it with the skin." Most of us did as he instructed. Another confusing wash of flavor greeted me. Lavender and basil, lemon and cherry, seaweed and licorice. "I like it better without the skin," someone said. "Are you kidding? It's terrible without the skin. With the skin, it's incredible," said someone else. Of course, it's normal for different people to like different foods, but this much disparity in what we were all experiencing was astounding, especially considering we were all eating pieces cut from the same fruit. Thomas seemed too absorbed in his adoration to notice what the others were saying. He picked up the second wedge, that of the yellow-fleshed, unripened fruit, and the rest of us followed suit. The flesh on this fruit was crisp like an apple, but still very juicy. The flavor was once again a wash of all things: wheatgrass, pine, chocolate, cumin, pineapple, cucumber, and 5 more flavors every time I chewed. I could not wrap my head around this thing. Once again, a few members of the group seemed disgusted by the fruit, while the rest were enamored. I wondered if the fruit was triggering some kind of genetic aversion in some of us in the same way that cilantro does. "It's heaven! So light and refreshing," someone proclaimed. "It tastes like chemicals. Are you sure it's okay to eat this?" said another. For hours, we all debated back and forth the flavor of the fruit. Thomas collected up both the red and the green seeds, boiled half of them, and roasted the other half in my oven, And that set off a whole other debate. The green ones taste like Christmas cookies, but the red ones are foul. The roasted red ones are fine, but the boiled red ones don't taste like anything. You don't think they all taste the same? It made no sense. It was as if every one of us was eating completely different things. As the night came to a close, one of my friends, who was a brilliant pastry chef, asked if he might take a few of the fruits with him so that he could experiment with them in his kitchen. I granted his request, excited to see what he might come up with. Thomas collected a few of the fruits as well, saying he wanted to see if he could cultivate a tree of his own. I didn't see anything wrong with that. "I do have one question for you," I said as I walked him to his car. "How long do trees usually produce fruit?" He shrugged. "A few weeks, sometimes a month or two, it just depends." "Because that tree has been producing fruit pretty steadily for months now," I said. Thomas wrinkled his brow. "It has, hasn't it?" "Huh." Dr. Freeman came over every few weeks to collect new specimens to examine. "I honestly think this is a new species," she told me. "Is that normal for a new species of plant to just show up in a suburban backyard?" I asked. "Well, it's not usual, but it's not impossible either. The strange thing is that this plant is distantly related to a lot of other plants, but genetically it has more in common with an elephant than it does to anything local. I suspect that a mutated foreign seed somehow made its way to your backyard. Maybe it's been there for ages, lying dormant, and it just decided the time was right to grow. Or maybe one of the previous owners of the house planted something without knowing what it was. Either way, it's pretty exciting in my world." "Do you know why the fruit tastes different to everyone?" She shook her head. "That's not really something we can determine. As for the chemical makeup of the fruit, I can tell you how much sugar it has or how much acidity, but taste is a very subjective thing. I can't tell you what an apple tastes like to me any more than I can explain what the color red looks like to me. People taste different things because their brain has been hardwired by different experiences, and those experiences form the basis for different comparisons. It's really hard for our brains to understand a new stimulus right off the bat. They have to connect it to something that they already know, and then, over time, it develops nuance over the top of it and creates a whole new experience." "What do they taste like to you?" I asked. She smiled softly. "They taste like fresh country air," she said. "Or at least the ripe ones do. The unripe ones taste awful." Within a year, Thomas had his own little grove of blue fruit trees growing in the back of a community garden. People from all over the city flocked to sample the fruits. News stories were written about them, and pictures of them went viral. Articles were written claiming the blue fruits were incredibly healthy and could cure all sorts of diseases, but none of these claims had been proven in any sort of clinical tests. My pastry chef friend had been the first one to try and cook them, experimenting with adding the blue fruits to different recipes, but apparently their extraordinary flavor did not translate well when cooked, and the fruits normally disintegrated when heated. He began serving them fresh as part of a curated fruit plate. People were so desperate to try the blue fruits that he had to limit how many of them could be served in a day. Eventually, he began growing several trees in pots on the rooftop of his restaurant, just so that he could keep pace with the demand. No matter where we planted the trees, they seemed to take root and flourish. Thomas sent seeds to friends of his all over the world in all sorts of different climates, and every single one of them was able to get the trees to grow without any trouble. My tree, and all the trees directly descended from the fruits it produced, were identical for the most part, and once they fruited, they never stopped producing, but the plants seemed to be mutating the farther away from the source that they got. Others reported that their plants only produced purple fruits. Some only produced green fruits with tough flesh. Others never produced any fruit at all. Geneticists began tinkering with the seeds, crossing the trees with other things to try and make them more uniform, but from all the reports I saw, their efforts had varying degrees of success. Once, while on vacation, I came across a store in Germany that had fresh blue fruits for sale. At that point, I had never tasted any fruit that hadn't come from my own tree, so I was curious to see how these distant relatives tasted. The blue fruits there had a funny green tinge to them, not the clear blue color of mine, and the flavor was astringent and extremely watered down. I asked the owner of the shop where they had come from, and he explained that a farmer just outside of town had begun to grow the blue fruit trees, using seeds he'd bought online. I went to visit the orchard and introduced myself to the farmer, but didn't tell him that I was the owner of the original blue fruit tree. "They're not very good, are they?" he chuckled as he watched me try one fresh from one of the trees. "I don't care for them myself either, but other people seem to like them. If you ask me, they're just a bit of a gimmick. Everyone's curious, so they try them once and then never again. I'll probably rip these out of the ground after a little while." I asked him if he had ever tried a blue fruit before he planted his orchard. He shook his head. "I couldn't get my hands on one before I found the seeds, but now I've had plenty of them. They don't get any better." I extended my vacation and made a few unplanned trips to other countries in search of more blue fruits. Every time I had one, it was a disappointment. Their texture was mealy, or their flavor was so diluted that they tasted like nothing. Some of them had barely any flesh on them because the seeds had grown so big. One variety had even developed a pith-like membrane under the skin like a lemon or an orange, and it took over the pink flesh entirely. How had these fruits mutated so wildly in only a few years? I've never had a head for science, but even I knew this shouldn't have been possible. When I finally returned home, the first thing I did was pluck a blue fruit from my own tree and bite into it. I savored the rainbow of flavor I'd always experienced when eating fruits from my own tree. Peppermint, cotton candy, raspberry, charcoal, garlic, a chromatic array of tastes that was all at once wonderful and slightly disconcerting. I took my fruit inside and sat at my kitchen table, watching videos on my phone as I munched away and tried to process my thoughts. I hadn't grown the tree. I had just happened to be there when it decided to come into existence, but I felt a certain kind of ownership over what had happened to it. The corruption of the blue fruits as they had traveled across the world disturbed me, and I wished that in the early days I had been a bit more selective about who I allowed to take the fruits and seeds. It was sad to think that people like the farmer in Germany had never and would never know what the first blue fruits really tasted like. All they knew was the vastly inferior versions. I watched a trailer on my phone for a remake of a childhood favorite film and shook my head in disgust. Why did they have to alter the original when it was perfect the way it was? It's not as if people didn't have access to it or couldn't watch that version anymore. Why did that story need to be retold? And then, the words Dr. Freeman had spoken to me long ago about why the blue fruits tasted different to everyone came back to me. People taste different things because their brains have been hardwired by different experiences. I remembered how a few of my friends had spit out the blue fruit the first time we tried it, while the rest of us had stared at them like they were out of their minds. Perhaps there were people in the world so used to and attached to the taste of their local variety of blue fruit that if they ever sampled the fruit from my tree, they'd spit it out too. I took another bite of the blue fruit. Almonds, carrots, beef jerky, butter, and sweet wine. After all these years, I still couldn't decide whether or not I liked the blue fruit, but there was something comforting in recognizing its flavor as the same one I'd tasted all those years ago.